So, since it is Father's Day, I know we were supposed to do denominations part two, but I wasn't sure if we'd have a lot of people show up. And then I thought we'd look at some dads in the Bible and kind of talk about uh, dads. Because I know that we have some tough. One minute, I need to unplug these headphones. I know we have some tough parental situations. Um, and we don't all have great relationships with our dad. So I thought we would kind of look and see about other biblical examples of dads and how that went for everybody. Spoiler, there's a lot of not so great dads in the Bible. Now, some of that, to be fair to these guys, was there was kind of a different perspective of being a father in biblical days than there is today. Today, we expect fathers to, like, I don't know, love their kids, hang out with them, that kind of stuff. And depending on what time period we're talking about in the Bible, if we're talking about really ancient times like Genesis versus, kind of Jesus's time, there's kind of societal expectations of what a father looks like changes, right? I don't know. I'm sure you've all watched the movie Bambi, right? So Bambi, in a lot of ways, while traumatizing, is it's kind of about the 1950s nuclear family, right? So you have Bambi, you have his mom, and you have his dad, but the dad's never around. And he's very aloof, and he just kind of swoops in and looks stern and then goes off. And it's really all on the mom to raise Bambi until, of course, she's shot. And so that was kind of the expectations of dads in the 1950s, right? Was that they didn't really do any fathering. They came in and they were stern and, maybe might discipline and, that kind of stuff. In ancient times, in Abraham's time, children were kind of like property, right? We've talked about how women were property, but children were too. You owned them. And I mean, you were responsible for them. You were supposed to provide for them. But, how much you spent time with them, whether they were considered worth your time, these were not like they are today. Today, people want to hang out with their children. They like doing that. They want to show them the movies that they saw when they were a kid. But society was very different. So, it can be hard because we look at these biblical dads and we're like, oh, they were all terrible. And to a certain extent, that is true. But for the most part, I'm only going to try to judge them for things that they really did wrong, that even in the standards of their time were questionable. Yeah. So let's go on to Abraham while we're here. So Abraham only had two sons, but he did have a nephew, Lot. And we're going to talk about that. So if you guys remember, Abraham was kind of the first Hebrew. That's not how he would have thought of himself, but he is the father of the Hebrew nation. And that's what God promised him, that if he followed God and left his people behind, that God would make him a father of many nations. And when Abraham left Babylon and Ur, he left with his wife and his whole household, which included his nephew, Lot. So that's one of the ways in which Abraham was a really good dad. After his brother died, he took in Lot. Now, Lot was, I don't know what age Lot was when his father died. I think his father's name was Haran. Was he 20? Was he 10? Was he 25? Was he 30? I don't know. But in Abraham's time, there was an expectation that Abraham, as kind of the paterfamilias of the family, would look after everyone in the family. And that included his brother's kids. Because if you'll remember, if you're the person who provided for you died, your father or whatever, you could often end up destitute and on the streets. So what Abraham did here was good. He took in Lot. He made Lot part of his family. And while Lot was never his heir, possibly if he had never had kids, Lot would have been his heir. Now, if you also remember the story of Abraham, you will recall that God promised Abraham a son, an heir of his own bloodline. And when God did that, Abraham laughed because he was like, God, I'm old and my wife is old. We're not going to have kids. And God was like, just you wait, Abraham, you are. I've made you a promise. And at some point, Abraham and Sarah decided they didn't really trust God to deliver on this promise that Abraham would have a son by Sarah. And Sarah was like, maybe he just means you'll have a son and it doesn't have to be by me. So Sarah gave Abraham her slave. And Abraham and that slave had a son named Ishmael. And for 13 years, Abraham raised Ishmael as his heir. He taught him things. He would have been treated with respect in the family, as much respect as a kid is treated, right? But then what happens is Sarah does become pregnant and Isaac is born. And this is where we get into Abraham's bad dadness, which is that after Isaac was born, he decided he didn't need Ishmael anymore because apparently we only need sons if they're useful to us. So Isaac was the one he wanted to be the heir. Isaac was Sarah's son. Ishmael was the son of a slave. And suddenly Ishmael was a threat to Isaac's inheritance in Sarah's eyes, in Abraham's eyes. And so the way they dealt with this was they basically evicted Ishmael and his mother Hagar from the camp. And this is in the desert, and they basically sent them out to die. The full expectation here was that Hagar and Ishmael would die in the desert. These are not the actions of a good dad who cares about you. Your dad should never try to kill you. So what happens is God saves Hagar and Ishmael. That Hagar, however you want to say it, she calls upon God. She calls him the God who sees. She's one of the few people in the Bible who names God. And we're going to talk about this story more when we actually talk about Abraham and Sarah and Ishmael and Isaac. And God provides them water and they live. Because even though Abraham decided that Ishmael was no longer worth his time, God did not make that same decision. So Abraham was a bad dad who abandoned his oldest son to die. So you would think Isaac is the chosen son, right? Isaac is the one that he's put all his hopes and dreams on. So that means he's going to be a great dad to Isaac, right? Right. So there's a story. It's a pretty famous story where Abraham almost sacrifices Isaac to God. So there are two ways to interpret this story. God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And Abraham says yes. And he's sad about it, but he's going to do it because God gave him Isaac and God can take Isaac away. Sure. And the way that we read the story is that this was a test of of Abraham's obedience to God, right? That Abraham was going to go all the way through with it. Abraham went all the way up to the point of basically tying his son to the altar to kill him when God stopped it and brought a ram, I believe it was, for Abraham to sacrifice instead. So the traditional interpretation is that Abraham acted rightly, that this was a test of his loyalty to God and not viewing anything above God. Now, there are reasons why we hold that interpretation to be true. And one of them is because we should hold God in higher regard than anything else on this planet. I think it's Jesus who says to a wannabe disciple in the New Testament that he should leave behind his father, his brother, his mother, everything, and follow Jesus. And that wannabe disciple, doesn't, right? And he doesn't follow Jesus. But what God was asking Abraham to do here was wrong. And God knew that. And that's why he stopped it. And this is sort of a lesson in that God is not a God who requires human sacrifice, because a lot of other gods at that time did. And this was kind of the foundational story in Judaism that's like, no, that is not how this God rolls. He does not require human sacrifice. So, going with that idea, the other interpretation is that this was a test Abraham failed. That God expected Abraham to fight him. Because if you read about God in the Old Testament, there's a lot of times where he tests people and asks them to do things. And then those people fight God and change his mind. And whether you believe God changed his mind or it was a test, that's a argument we can have. But you see this with Moses. You see this with other people, where God's like, oh, nope, I'm done. Let's just kill them all over again. And Moses is like, no, whoa, God, you can't do that. And, God was like testing Moses to see where he fell kind of on the spectrum. And so you can view this as God testing Abraham to see if Abraham knew God was different from all the other gods of his time, right? That if Abraham understood the God he was following. And I think the answer is no, Abraham did not. Abraham saw God to be like any other God of his time period, which is that, he asked for human sacrifice, that's what I'm going to give him. And so Abraham didn't fight, and in the end, God had to stop it. Regardless of which interpretation you believe. Imagine this story from Isaac's perspective. This is pretty terrifying. You're like a kid. Your dad's like, come with me, Isaac. We're going to go out and make a sacrifice to God. And you're like, cool, Dad, let's go. And then along the way, Isaac asked over and over, like, what are we sacrificing? Where's the lamb or whatever? Dad? Like, what's happening? And in the end, Abraham, like, picks you up, your dad, and ties you to an altar. And you probably know what's going to happen at that point. This has to be a super traumatizing event in Isaac's life. There's no way it's not. So whether Abraham failed or passed the test, from Isaac's perspective, this is probably a foundational traumatizing experience in his entire life. So I'm going to put it under the bad dad category. It was a bad move, Abraham. Don't sacrifice your children. So yeah, Abraham was a mixed bag. He did some good things. He did some bad things. He's human, right? I really hope none of your dads have abandoned you to die or tried to sacrifice you. So, next dad that we're going to look at is Jacob. Oh, I forgot to... He had a lot of sons. He had 12 sons and one daughter, Dinah. If you remember the story, he had 2 wives proper and 2 wives improper, if you will. So 2 wives who were not slaves and 2 wives who were slaves. And we've talked about this before when we talked about Genesis. But while the translators make a choice between interpreting something wife versus concubine, the Hebrew doesn't actually make a choice. It's always just referred to as so-and-so's woman. So that's a biblical interpretive choice. But the reason why Leah and Rachel would be considered on a different level than the other 2 wives is because the other 2 wives were slaves. So they had no choice, right? So he had all of these sons, bunches of sons, 4 wives. Jacob loved Rachel more. And she really struggled to have kids. And so Leah had all these sons, his slaves had sons, and Rachel gave him no sons until in the end she gave him Joseph. And Jacob loved Joseph more. So, on the good dad side, none of his kids actually murdered each other. They were tempted to. They talked about it, but none of them actually did. Also on the good dad side, he provided for them. They seemed to have had a safe home, right? Other than the threats they posed to each other, it doesn't seem like Jacob tried to kill any of his kids. He did learn to be a better dad and man, I think, after the events of the famous story. But on the bad dad side, he played extreme favorites, to a point where it caused his sons to be in such competition that they wanted to off Joseph. They wanted to kill him. And it was only because one of the other sons intervened that they instead sold Joseph into slavery. Now, whether slavery is better than death is a matter of opinion. And that is how Joseph ended up a slave in Egypt, right? So this was really traumatizing to Jacob and Joseph, obviously. And I think Jacob did learn from this. And the sons certainly learned from this, as we see with Benjamin later, that they regretted what they did to Joseph. But dads really shouldn't be setting up these scenarios where you're in a scenario of favoritism so extreme that the other kids think that murdering one of the other kids is the only option. This is a very intense, beyond Thor and Loki scenario, right? Odin played favorites with Thor and Loki. But Thor and Loki, I guess Loki he tried to kill Thor. So, it's kind of similar. So Jacob was not a great dad. Now, what's interesting about Jacob, and one of the things I want to talk about, is his father also played favorites. So you would think Jacob would have learned from his father. Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau, and he definitely preferred Esau. You would think that when you've experienced such favoritism that hurt you, that you wouldn't take that favoritism and that hurt and put it on your kids. This is what we call generational trauma, and kind of cycles of abuse, right? Which is not to excuse anything. Nobody is excused from hurting other people. But sometimes when what you learn from your parents is a certain way, you get stuck in this cycle where you enact it on your children, even if it hurt you. Because in a lot of ways, it's the only way you've been taught to be a parent, right? Jacob's father played favorites. And then Jacob maybe just thought that's how you be a dad. And it's wrong. And there's a lot of ways to break cycles of trauma. But sometimes we forget that our parents are humans too. Right. And that doesn't excuse any hurt or pain they cause us, but it does help explain it, that they, the world would be better if a lot of these people just went to therapy, but they didn't have therapy in Jacob's time. Jacob should have worked this out with a third party before he started having 13 children. That's a lot of kids, you guys. It's a lot of kids. All right. Our next bad dad, David. David had a lot of kids. This isn't even all of them, a lot. There's a lot of kids here. Amnon, Kileab, Absalom, Adonijah, Shebediah, Ithram, Shemiah, Shabab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Elpalat, Noga, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishima, Elida, Eliphelet, not to be confused with Elpelet, and Tamar. Tamar is the only girl I've listed here because she's relevant. They often didn't list daughters. Now, going back to Jacob, we know he only had the one daughter. He had 12 sons, one daughter. In David's scenario, I have no idea how many daughters he had. And he possibly had more sons than this because he had a lot of wives. On the good dad camp, he provided for them and he didn't murder any of them himself. So, Mike, that's a lot of kids. What were you thinking, Dave? I don't think he was thinking. With kings, they really wanted to secure their nice dynastic line. Dynastic. I can't say that word. Dynastic line. And so having more kids in that sense was good. But at some point, you can have so many kids that you can't pay attention to any of them. And ultimately, that was David's failure as a father, was that he didn't pay attention to any of them. I think he was a completely absent father. We see no indication that he took any hand in his children's raising. And he was just this far off father figure who, didn't care. So that led to a couple of things. He didn't defend his own daughter from his own son. So we've talked about this story in this class before, and we're going to get to it again this year in our cycle of people of the Bible. But Amnon was David's oldest son, his heir. And then Tamar was one of David's daughters. And then, because people are disturbing, Amnon raped Tamar. David didn't protect her. Okay, maybe he couldn't. Our dads can't always protect us from the world. But the thing that makes it worse is not that he did protect her, is that after the fact, when he knew it happened, he did nothing. He didn't punish Amnon. He didn't do anything to protect Tamar. Tamar had to go to her brother Absalom. And Absalom was the one who offered her comfort. She and Absalom shared a mother, where she and Amnon did not. And basically defended her honor. And wanted to go after Amnon. He wanted Amnon's head. And David was like, nah, bro. Don't do anything. David wanted to do nothing. He was just like, just leave him. Whatever. And, granted at this point his kids are adults, but David is the king. He is the head of his country. This is not like people running, the kids are gone and running amok. This is like, he is the head of the country. He is well in the head of his line. He is well within his rights to deal with Amnon, whether that's, jail, some sort of monetary punishment, death. There were a lot of ways you deal with rapists in the ancient world. And David decided he was going to do nothing. He refused to discipline his children in any way. So we already talked about Amnon. So this led to Absalom wanting to kill Amnon, and he did. And Absalom kind of started a little coup thing, and David was like, oh, I don't really want to deal with it. But his generals in the end kind of forced him to act. Same with Adonijah. He also tried to throw David over. If your children are trying to overthrow you, you probably weren't a great dad to them. They have no affection for you at this point. They just want you dead so they can take your throne. And David really didn't want to deal with it. He was just like, oh, whatever. I mean, David was a man who fought a civil war in his youth against Saul. You think he would have more strong feelings about his children trying to overthrow him. But instead, he only acted when forced to. And he allowed, that's the big thing here. All of Israel suffered because David was a bad dad. He allowed these kids to run amok. He allowed these coups and civil war unrest to develop because he didn't want to act. He didn't want to discipline his own children. He didn't want to have anything to do with them. That's a bad dad. David. I guess Solomon turned out okay, right? He became king after David. Solomon had his quirks and foibles, but I'm not sure how much of that we can lay at David's hands, right? I'm not sure how much David raised Solomon and how much of that is Bathsheba. Because David, it seems, didn't really do a lot to father his kids. Partly because, like Mike said, he had so many kids he didn't know what to do with. Like old Mother Hubbard. You would think he would at least invest in his heirs, in his oldest. So that would be like Amnon, Absalom, Adonijah. But he didn't. I don't even know what to say. It's crazy. All right, so lots of bad dads. What about a good one? Joseph of New Testament fame. So Joseph had Joseph, James, Jude, Simon, and probably at least 3 unnamed daughters. I feel like I read somewhere that there were 7 kids in this family. So 2 daughters. I can't count. It's fine. But we know Jesus had sisters, but in traditional biblical fashion, these sisters are not named. So Joseph, what makes him a good dad? Well, first off, he adopted Jesus and raised him as his own. You guys know the story, right? Joseph was engaged to Mary, and he found out she was pregnant, and he assumed she was having an affair. So he was going to divorce her quietly because he was a nice guy and he didn't want to disgrace her, but he didn't want to marry her if she was having an affair. And in the end, God comes to him and is like, no, 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 that's my son. You must raise him as your own. And Joseph's like, okay, God said that's what I'm going to do. So that's what I'm going to do. And that's actually a big deal. Adoption was not super common in the ancient world like it is today. People were less likely to take someone else's kid in as their own. So Joseph also protected Jesus when his life was in danger. When the threat of Herod wanted to kill all the babies around Jesus's age. And so Joseph left his country. He left everything he knew and went to Egypt. Hannah says, adoption is almost impossible in Japan. Really? So what did they do with babies who need families? Did they just find other family members to take them? We will wait for Hannah's answer on that. But that's a big deal to leave Israel and go to Egypt. Oh, Hannah said basically they find other family members to take them. Well, different countries have different kind of philosophies. Now in Jesus's day, adoption would be easier. There's no paperwork, right? You could basically just steal a baby and claim it as your own, but it was less likely to happen. Don't steal babies. So Joseph moved to Egypt. He stayed there for many years, and he did that to protect Jesus. One of the other things I think I forgot to list here was Joseph taught Jesus his trade. Joseph was a carpenter, and he taught Jesus to be a carpenter. So he raised his sons, he gave them trades, and they all seem to have come out to be good people. There's not really any bad stories of any of these guys. We know at least James and Jude became disciples. James wrote the book of James, and Jude wrote the book of Jude. So it seems like Joseph did a pretty good job. We don't really know a lot about him beyond this, though. But I've got nothing. Seems like Joseph was a pretty good dad and not a particularly bad one. So why talk about... Jesus is a hard act to follow if he's the oldest, Mike said. Yeah, I actually have really strong feelings about this. Could you imagine being Jesus's younger sibling? Could you just imagine your parents looking at you and being like, why can't you be more like Jesus? And you're just like, because he's perfect. I'm sorry angels didn't sing when I was born, Mom. I actually think it's a testament to Jesus, truly being God and the Messiah, that so many of his siblings became Christians. Because let me tell you, if any of my siblings woke up tomorrow and declared they were God and the Messiah, I would laugh. And I would not let that stand. So the fact that these guys could look back and be like, our brother was God and the Messiah, and we should be more like him. I think that says a lot to that Jesus truly was the Son of God. And I think Jesus wouldn't leave his siblings behind. He wouldn't let them suffer for being born in the same family as him. I mean, they suffered in the sense that all Christians at that time period suffered. I think they died horrible deaths, but not suffer eternally because they happened to be born in his family. So dads, why do we talk about dads? Well, we all have them. Even if you don't know your dad, even if your dad's a good dad or a bad dad, even if you're adopted, right? We all, at some point, there is a biological male who helped produce us. And a lot of us do live with our dads. Some of us have been deeply hurt by our dads. And it's important to talk about this, not just as people, not just because it's trauma we're working through, but because the Bible asks us over and over again to look at God as a father. And when you struggle with your own father, that can be really hard. And I know some of your stories. I know some of you have been hurt by your dads. I know some of you struggle with your dads. I know some of you feel abandoned by your dads, and I know some of you have great dads. I know some of you have dads who have stepped in, like Joseph, who were not even your biological dad and have come into the picture and said, I choose you, Pikachu. Like, I am going to be a father to you, even if your previous father has failed. And some of us just have great biological dads. They've been there our whole lives. They've always supported us, and when your dad is great like that, it's easy to be like, yes, God is a father, God who supports me, God who raises me, God who corrects me when I'm wrong, but, loves me no matter what. It's easy for those of us with good dads. Those of us with bad dads, it's a bit harder. It's harder to understand the line between discipline and abuse sometimes when our dad is bad. When your dad is Abraham and he like kicks you out of the family to go die in the desert, Ishmael may be like, why should I think of God as a father? Fathers suck. And the first thing I want to say is you don't have to think of God as a father. There's no biblical mandate. You will not get into heaven if you don't think of God as a father. We've talked about in this class before, but God is genderless, right? God is neither male nor female. Man and women are created in his image. We use male pronouns for God because it's easier and because the Bible was written by patriarchal men who viewed the God as a man because God would have to be a man to, rule over them, right? But ultimately, God is genderless. Jesus had a gender. Jesus was male. And we've talked about before, there were reasons for that. But there are examples in the Bible of God as a mother, God nurturing, God caring, which isn't to say fathers don't nurture and care. But once again, these are kind of stereotypical, ancient views of fathers versus mothers, right? And if it helps you to view God as a mother, feel free. If it helps you to think of God as a she, feel free. If it helps you to think of God as they, feel free, right? God is unlimited, genderless. The key here, when we think of God the Father, is you think of God the parent, God the creator, God the influence in your life that helps you grow and become a better person. And if thinking of God as a father stops you from viewing, if that hurts you, you don't have to think of him that way. Okay? But God is there. He created us all. He's the ultimate parent. Jesus was his son, but we have all, as Christians, been adopted into the family. There's texts in Romans in the New Testament about that, about being grafted into the family, being adopted in. That our grafting is how apple trees actually reproduce, because apple trees don't breed true. So you get crab apples when you plant apple seeds. If you want a red delicious apple, you actually have to take a limb from a red delicious tree and place it on another tree. So that's what God has done with us. He has taken us Christians and he has grafted us on the tree that Jesus and the Jewish people are on. So God has chosen us. That's the important thing here, that he is raising us and helping us to become better people. In the Bible, sometimes people get disciplined for their actions. Sometimes most of those discipline is natural consequences, right? You have to live with the consequences of your actions. But God is not a bad father. This, it can be hard, right? I mean, I've talked before about how I struggle with the prodigal son story, and how people try to make the prodigal son's father, as if he is God. And that is one way to interpret that story. But my struggle with interpreting that story that way was, then I was like, well, then this makes a bad father. Because he forgot his other son existed in the field, right? And we've talked about that. But know that your father being a certain way does not mean God is a certain way. And knowing that, all metaphors at some point break down. God is greater than all of the examples that we can use to think of God, right? He is better. He is greater. God loves us. He wants what's best for us. And sometimes bad things happen because we live in a fallen and broken world. Um, but yeah, I, I just know it's hard, especially as kids, right? Because our parents are our whole world. Like you're teenagers, so you probably don't think of it that way. But they are the biggest influence in your life. Even if you're pulling away to friends, more, and as you get your independence, like your parents were there first. They, what is this? There's a saying that's like, your parents know how to push your buttons because they installed them. So it can be hard. And I just want you to know that we're all human. Your parents are human. Even good parents are going to hurt you on occasion, and they're going to wrong you on occasion. That's just the nature of human and sin. And it is okay if you struggle on days like Father's Day. It is okay if you'd rather just not go to church on Father's Day some years because you can't deal with it when you're an adult, and you're going to a church where the lesson's all going to be about great fathers and how they're awesome, and you're like, my dad wasn't. If that's what you're feeling, that is okay. But God is the ultimate father. He is the ultimate parent. He is the perfect one, right? And he will not hurt you like your fathers may have. He will not fail you. And he will always be faithful. That doesn't mean everything in life is going to go the way you want. That doesn't mean we're never going to be hurt. That doesn't mean you're going to get what you want in life. But it means that no matter what happens, God will be the shoulder for you to cry on. He will feel your pain with you. He will walk beside you. And if it's something he can give you, he will try to, right? I mean, I say try to, like God is limited. And it's not. God is not limited. But, once again, we live in a broken world, and sometimes it's our own bad decisions that hurt us. God may want you to have X, but you decided you were going to get Y. I mean, just look at Abraham, right? God promised Abraham Isaac. Abraham decided he couldn't wait. And because of that, he had Ishmael. And because of that, he hurt Ishmael. And these are Abraham's actions, the consequences of his own actions. He created this pain. But, even in that pain, even though Ishmael was not someone that, I don't know how to say it. It's not that he wasn't someone that God planned for. God sees all the options, right? He knows where things are going. But Ishmael wasn't the perfect plan. He wasn't the optimal plan. But despite that, God was faithful to Ishmael too, right? Abraham betrayed Ishmael. God did not. God was faithful. God brought Hagar and Ishmael out of that, and God made Ishmael the father of a great nation. As well. This is actually how Abraham became the father of many nations. The Ishmaelites, the Hebrews, and also he had another wife, Keturah, I think her name was, and he had many children by her as well. So God is always faithful, and this is I'm kind of winging it. This is a lesson I was kind of winging, if you can't tell, because originally we were going to do denominations part 2, and then I decided that we should talk about fathers. Because it is Father's Day. It can be hard. For some of you, it can be great. Some of you are separated from your fathers. Like Hannah, right? Maybe you miss them, and that's okay. Now, in today's modern world, it's even easier, right? You can just chat with your dad on the computer. It's great. It didn't used to be that way. So it's okay if Father's Day is hard for you. It's okay if you struggle to see God as a father. Just know that when we say God is father, it is okay if you transplant that into your head as God as parent, or God as mother, or God as grandparent, or God as mentor, whatever helps you to not hold your human connections against God, right? So that's really today's lesson. Not super long, not super deep. If you do struggle with your father, you can just look to the Bible and see how many people have struggled with their Bible. This with their father. This is an ancient struggle. Parents are not perfect. Parents sometimes take the trauma they experience as kids and put it on their own kids, often unintentionally. Therapy would help a lot of people in this world. There are some good dads in the Bible. Trevor and I were kind of debating about that. Like, David's dad, as far as we know, probably wasn't that bad. He had like 7 sons. And, didn't seem to do anything bad against them. Saul, while crazy king of Israel, seemed like he had a pretty good relationship with his sons for the most part. But there are a lot of examples of bad dads, so you're not alone if that is what you are experiencing. So, like I said, that's today's lesson. Pretty short. Next week we will do denominations part 2, kind of looking at what the different denominations believe. So, please join us for that. And,